A heavy mist clung to the weathered stone walls of St. Michael's Church, its ancient bell tower barely visible through the gossamer shroud of an unseasonably cold autumn morning. Inside, the air hung thick with grief and the cloying scent of too many lilies, as the village gathered to bid farewell to Hannah Matthews. The beloved librarian's passing had struck the close-knit community hard, drawing even the most reclusive residents from their homes to pay their respects. Wooden pews creaked beneath the weight of somber mourners, their black attire a stark contrast to the warm, honey-colored stone that had sheltered generations of villagers in times of joy and sorrow. Some dabbed at eyes with cotton handkerchiefs passed down through generations, while others sat in stoic silence, their grief too profound for tears. In the front row, Hannah's loyal companion Duke, a dignified German shepherd with graying muzzle, lay quietly at the foot of her casket, his brown eyes fixed on the ornate wooden doors at the back of the church. Father Michael stood at the pulpit, his usually commanding presence diminished by an uncharacteristic nervousness that manifested in the constant adjustment of his collar and the slight tremor in his hands as he shuffled his prepared eulogy. His voice, normally rich and resonant, wavered slightly as he spoke of Hannah's dedication to the community, her tireless work with the children's reading program, and her generous spirit. Hannah Matthews, he began, clearing his throat, was more than just our librarian. She was the keeper of our stories, the guardian of our community's knowledge, and a friend to all who sought wisdom within the pages of a book. His fingers drummed an irregular rhythm on the wooden ledge, a detail that didn't go unnoticed by the keen eyes of David Chun, who sat near the back of the church. David, recent arrival to the village, had known Hannah only briefly, but something about her death had struck him as odd from the moment he'd heard the news. Perhaps it was the way people lowered their voices when speaking of it, or the haunted look that crossed Father Michael's face whenever her name was mentioned. As a former investigative journalist, David had learned to trust these subtle signs that suggested there was more to a story than met the eye. The service continued, a somber hymn filling the vaulted ceiling with mournful notes, when suddenly Duke's demeanor changed. The dog's ears pricked forward, his body tensing as he raised his head and fixed his gaze more intently on the church doors. A low whine emerged from his throat, growing in volume until it became an urgent howl that echoed through the sacred space. The hymn faltered, voices trailing off as heads turned toward the source of the disruption. Father Michael's hands gripped the pulpit edge, his knuckles white with tension. "Please," he said, his voice strained, "someone remove the dog. This is hardly appropriate for." But before he could finish, Duke was on his feet, his howl becoming more insistent. The dog's behavior sent a ripple of unease through the congregation. Elderly Mrs. Whitaker clutched her pearls, muttering about omens, while young Tommy Bradford pressed closer to his mother's side, eyes wide with a child's mixture of fear and fascination. David watched as several people moved to quiet Duke, but the dog remained fixated on the doors, his body rigid with attention. In David's experience, animals often sensed things that humans missed, and Duke's reaction seemed more than mere grief. The dog's unwavering focus on the church entrance suggested he was responding to something specific, or someone. The tension in the church grew palpable as Duke's howls continued, his message urgent and unintelligible to human ears. Father Michael's attempts to restore order became increasingly desperate, his voice rising to compete with the dog's cries. But it was the priest's reaction that truly caught David's attention, not just frustration at the interruption, but something that looked remarkably like fear. Several villagers exchanged knowing glances, whispering behind raised hands about old superstitions regarding dogs and death. "They say animals can sense things," David overheard Mrs. Whitaker telling her neighbor, her voice trembling. "My grandmother used to tell stories about dogs howling before tragic events, marking the presence of spirits or unnatural deaths." The moment stretched, taut as a bowstring, until finally, the heavy wooden doors began to creak open. Sunlight spilled through the widening gap, creating a brilliant corona that momentarily blinded those watching. Duke's howls reached a crescendo, and in that moment of chaos and anticipation, David noticed something else. Father Michael had gone completely pale, his hands shaking so violently that his papers scattered across the pulpit like autumn leaves in a storm. As the doors swung wide, the entire congregation held its breath, waiting to see what presence had triggered such a reaction in Hannah's faithful companion. The light streaming through the doorway seemed to hold something momentous, something that would shatter the carefully maintained facade of this peaceful village and expose the darkness that lurked beneath its surface. In that suspended moment, David felt the weight of unspoken secrets pressing down on the assembly, heavy as the stone walls that surrounded them. He knew, with the certainty that had served him well throughout his investigative career, that Hannah Matthews' death was more than a simple tragedy. It was the first thread in a tapestry of deception that, when unraveled, would change this village forever. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the steady rhythm of footsteps echoing against stone, drawing closer to reveal the truth that Duke had sensed all along. The morning light caught dust motes swirling in the air, dancing like spirits awakened by the dog's mournful cry, as the village of St. Michael's stood on the precipice of a revelation that would shake its very foundations. In the front pew, Duke's howls subsided to a low growl, his eyes never leaving the figure now emerging from the brilliant backlight. The dog's unwavering vigilance seemed to speak of secrets yet to be revealed, of truths buried beneath years of careful deception, and of a mystery that would require both human intuition and canine instinct to unravel. David leaned forward, his reporter's instincts humming with anticipation. In the charged atmosphere of the church, as shadow and light played across worried faces and trembling hands, he could feel the first stirrings of a story that demanded to be told. A story of loyalty, betrayal, and the unexpected ways in which truth finds its voice, even in the most unlikely of messengers. The morning's events had transformed what should have been a simple farewell into something far more complex. And as David watched Duke's steadfast vigil, he knew that Hannah Matthews' story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning to unfold, with each howl and whimper from her faithful companion serving as a testament to secrets that could no longer remain buried. Something significant was about to be revealed in St. Michael's Church, something that would challenge everything the villagers thought they knew about their community and about Hannah Matthews herself. As the footsteps drew closer, David prepared himself for whatever truth was about to emerge from the shadows of this seemingly peaceful village, knowing that once revealed, nothing would ever be the same again. The morning's events had transformed what should have been a simple farewell into something far more complex, and as David watched Duke's steadfast vigil, he knew that Hannah Matthews' story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning to unfold, with each howl and whimper from her faithful companion serving as a testament to secrets that could no longer remain buried. Through the doorway stepped Inspector Sarah Blackwood, her weathered leather jacket and practical boots striking a discordant note among the formal funeral attire. The sharp angles of her face were softened by the golden light streaming through the stained glass windows, but nothing could dull the intensity of her gaze as it swept across the congregation before settling on Father Michael. The priest's already pale complexion turned ashen, his trembling hands now clasped tightly behind his back in a futile attempt to hide his distress. Duke's reaction to the inspector's arrival was immediate and unexpected. The dog's aggressive stance melted away, replaced by an almost expectant alertness, his tail giving a single, tentative wag. David noted this change with interest. He'd seen enough police dogs in his reporting days to recognize when a canine sensed an ally in law enforcement. "My apologies for interrupting," Inspector Blackwood announced, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed church. "But I'm afraid this service needs to be postponed." She moved down the center aisle with measured steps, each click of her boots against the stone floor echoing like a hammer striking an anvil. New evidence has come to light regarding Hannah Matthews' death. A collective gasp rippled through the congregation, followed by the rustle of clothing as people shifted in their seats, leaning forward as if drawn by an invisible thread. Mrs. Whitaker's pearl necklace clicked softly against itself as she clutched it tighter, her earlier whispers about omens now seeming prophetic rather than merely superstitious. David watched Father Michael's reaction intently. The priest's right hand had moved to his collar again, tugging at it as though it had suddenly become too tight. "Surely," Father Michael began, his voice cracking slightly. "This can wait until after we've paid our respects? The community needs closure, Inspector." "Closure requires truth, Father," Inspector Blackwood replied, reaching the front of the church. She turned to face the congregation, and David noticed how she positioned herself, slightly angled, keeping both the exits and Father Michael in her peripheral vision. It was the stance of someone who anticipated trouble. And the truth about Hannah Matthews' death has been buried under a landslide of lies. Duke padded over to the inspector's side, pressing against her leg in a gesture that seemed both protective and seeking protection. The dog's behavior continued to fascinate David. It was as if Duke had been waiting for this moment, for someone to finally give voice to the secrets he'd been unable to communicate. 3 days ago, Inspector Blackwood continued, Hannah Matthews' death was ruled natural causes, a heart attack, according to the initial report. She paused, her eyes scanning the faces before her. But last night, we received an anonymous tip that led us to evidence suggesting otherwise. Evidence that was deliberately concealed. The church's atmosphere grew heavier with each word, as if the ancient stones themselves were absorbing the weight of hidden truths. David noticed several of the older villagers exchanging meaningful glances, their expressions a complex mixture of fear and resignation. Whatever secrets lay buried in St. Michael's, they ran deep into the community's history. Father Michael's composure continued to deteriorate. A sheen of sweat had appeared on his forehead, and his attempts to maintain his authoritative demeanor were crumbling visibly. "Inspector," he tried again, "these people are grieving. Whatever investigations you need to conduct can surely wait until the evidence disappears completely." Inspector Blackwood cut him off sharply. "Like the missing pages from Hannah's diary? Or the church financial records from the past 3 months?" The mention of financial records caused a visible ripple through the congregation. David saw several members of the church council uncomfortably in their seats, while others seemed to shrink into themselves, as if trying to become invisible. The reaction confirmed his suspicions that Hannah's death was merely the surface of a much deeper scandal. Duke's ears pricked forward at the mention of the diary, and he let out a soft whine. The dog's gaze darted between the inspector and Father Michael, as if he were following a conversation that only he could fully understand. David remembered how Hannah had often been seen writing in that diary while sitting on the bench outside the library, Duke always faithfully at her feet. The dog had been present for whatever secrets she had committed to those pages. Inspector Blackwood reached into her jacket and withdrew a sealed evidence bag containing what appeared to be a torn page, its edges jagged and stained. "This was found this morning, hidden in a place that only someone with intimate knowledge of the church would know about." She held the page up, allowing the morning light to illuminate the handwriting visible through the plastic. "It's in Hannah's hand, dated the day before her death, and it details exactly what she discovered about the church's missing funds." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of Father Michael's prayer book slipping from his trembling fingers and clattering onto the pulpit. The noise seemed to startle him out of his paralysis, and he took an unsteady step backward, as if physically recoiling from the truth that was unfolding before his congregation. David had positioned himself near one of the side exits, his journalist's instincts telling him that this situation could escalate quickly. He wasn't the only one who sensed the mounting tension. Several of the younger parents had already begun quietly gathering their children, preparing for a hasty departure if needed. "Hannah Matthews didn't die of natural causes," Inspector Blackwood stated, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "She was silenced because she discovered something that threatened certain individuals within this community. Something that involved a significant amount of money and years of careful deception." As if on cue, Duke began to growl again, but this time his attention was fixed firmly on Father Michael. The priest's face had become a mask of desperation, his eyes darting between the inspector, the evidence in her hand, and the increasingly hostile faces of his congregation. David could almost see the moment when the man's resolve cracked, like a fissure appearing in stained glass. "You don't understand," Father Michael burst out, his voice pitched higher than normal. "The church needed those funds. The renovation project was essential, and the diocese wouldn't approve the full amount we required. I only meant to borrow temporarily, to ensure our beloved church wouldn't fall into disrepair. Hannah, she wouldn't listen to reason. She threatened to expose everything. The confession hung in the air like incense, heavy and cloying. Inspector Blackwood's expression remained impassive, but her posture tensed slightly, ready for whatever might come next. Duke's growl deepened, his loyalty to Hannah evident in every rigid line of his body. And when she wouldn't listen to reason, the inspector pressed, "What exactly did you do, Father?" The priest's composure shattered completely. "I never meant. It wasn't supposed to." His words dissolved into incoherent mumbling as he slumped against the pulpit, the weight of his actions finally breaking him. David watched as the scene unfolded, his mind already composing the story that would eventually emerge from this moment. But he knew that what was happening here was more than just a headline. It was the unraveling of a community's trust, the exposure of corruption in a place meant to represent truth and salvation. And at the center of it all was a loyal dog who had refused to let his master's death go unmarked or her killer unpunished. The morning light continued to stream through the stained glass windows, painting patterns of color across the faces of the shocked congregation. These were people who had trusted Father Michael with their spiritual guidance, their confessions, their donations. And now they were witnessing his own confession, forced into the light by the persistence of a faithful dog and the determination of a police inspector. The truth about Hannah Matthews' death was finally emerging, but David suspected that this was only the beginning. As he watched Inspector Blackwood move to formally arrest Father Michael, Duke maintaining his vigilant watch, he knew that the Real story was just starting to unfold. A story of faith betrayed, justice delayed but not denied, and the unbreakable bond between a woman and her dog that had reached beyond death itself to expose the truth. The church bells began to toll, their solemn notes marking not just the end of a funeral service, but the conclusion of one chapter in St. Michael's history and the beginning of another. The village would never be the same after this day, but perhaps, David thought, that wasn't entirely a bad thing. Sometimes it took the destruction of comfortable lies to make room for uncomfortable truths, and in that destruction, real healing could begin. The church bell's final toll faded into a heavy silence, broken only by the soft shuffle of feet as two police officers led Father Michael down the aisle. The priest's head was bowed, his shoulders slumped in defeat, a far cry from the commanding presence that had dominated the pulpit for over 15 years. As he passed the rows of stunned parishioners, some turned away, unable to bear the sight of their spiritual leader in handcuffs, while others stared openly, their expressions a complex mixture of betrayal and morbid fascination. David noticed how Duke's posture remained alert, the dog's eyes tracking Father Michael's every movement until he disappeared through the heavy wooden doors. Only then did the German shepherd's muscles relax slightly, though his vigilance never fully subsided. Inspector Blackwood crouched down beside the dog, her hand resting gently on his head in a gesture of understanding and respect. "Hannah would have been proud of you, old boy," she murmured, scratching behind his ears. "You never stopped trying to tell us something was wrong, did you?" The congregation began to disperse in small groups, their whispered conversations creating a low hum that echoed off the ancient stones. Mrs. Whitaker had dissolved into tears, being comforted by her daughter as they made their way toward the exit. "All those years," David overheard her saying, "all those bake sales and fundraisers. Where did the money really go?" Drawn by his journalistic instincts, David approached Inspector Blackwood, who was now examining the church's donation box with gloved hands. "The financial deception goes deeper than just the renovation project, doesn't it?" he asked, keeping his voice low. The inspector straightened up, fixing him with an appraising look. "Mr. Chun, isn't it? Hannah mentioned you in her diary. Said you asked too many questions for a newcomer." A slight smile softened her words. She meant it as a compliment. Before David could respond, a commotion near the vestry door drew their attention. Thomas Bradford, the church treasurer, was attempting to slip away unnoticed, his briefcase clutched tightly to his chest. Duke's head snapped up, a low growl rumbling in his throat. "Mr. Bradford, Inspector Blackwood called out, her voice carrying across the emptying church. I believe we need to have a conversation about those missing financial records. The treasurer froze, his face draining of color. The briefcase slipped from his trembling fingers, hitting the stone floor with a crash that echoed through the vaulted ceiling. Papers spilled out across the flagstones, bank statements, ledgers, and what appeared to be multiple ETS of books, each telling a different story about the church's finances. Duke moved swiftly, positioning himself between Bradford and the exit, his training as Hannah's companion evident in his precise movements. The dog's intervention proved unnecessary. Bradford's legs gave out, and he sank onto the nearest pew, burying his face in his hands. She found out everything, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Hannah discovered the whole scheme. It wasn't just Father Michael. We had a system in place for years, siphoning off donations, manipulating the accounts. Small amounts at first, but then David watched as Inspector Blackwood's team methodically gathered the scattered documents. Each piece of paper potentially another link in the chain of corruption that had strangled St. Michael's. The morning light streaming through the stained glass windows seemed harsher now, illuminating dark corners that had hidden secrets for far too long. Hannah confronted us that night, Bradford continued, his confession spilling out like water from a broken dam. She had proof, documentation going back nearly a decade. She threatened to expose everything, not just to the diocese, but to the authorities. She said the village deserved to know the truth about their donations, about the trust we'd betrayed. Inspector Blackwood pulled out her notebook, her pen poised over the paper. And then what happened, Mr. Bradford? The treasurer's eyes darted toward the vestry door, then back to his hands. Father Michael said he would handle it. He told me to go home, to destroy any records that could incriminate us. I never imagined he would. His voice cracked, unable to complete the terrible truth. Duke padded closer to Bradford, his growl now a continuous rumble of accusation. The dog's presence seemed to physically affect the treasurer, causing him to shrink further into himself, as if the weight of Hannah's faithful companion's judgment was more than he could bear. David's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of the story. Hannah Matthews hadn't just stumbled upon a simple case of embezzlement. She had uncovered a systematic corruption that had infected the very heart of St. Michael's. Her position as librarian, her meticulous nature, and her dedication to the truth had made her both the perfect person to discover the deception and, ultimately, its most dangerous threat. As if reading his thoughts, Inspector Blackwood turned to David. We'll need statements from everyone who had contact with Hannah in the days leading up to her death. I understand you spoke with her at the library the day before? David nodded, remembering his last conversation with Hannah. She had seemed distracted, anxious even, constantly checking over her shoulder as she reshelved books. Now he understood why. She mentioned something about numbers not adding up, he recalled. I offered to help. My background in investigative journalism might have been useful, but she said it was too dangerous to involve anyone else. She was trying to protect people, Inspector Blackwood said softly, watching as her officers began photographing the scattered financial documents. That's what made Hannah special. She always put others first, even when it put her own life at risk. Duke whined softly at the mention of his master's name, moving to sit beside David. The dog's presence was oddly comforting, as if he had recognized another ally in the quest for truth that Hannah had begun. The church, now almost empty except for law enforcement personnel, felt different, smaller somehow, as if the weight of its secrets had physically compressed the space. Sunlight continued to filter through the stained glass, but the colorful patterns on the floor seemed muted, subdued by the heavy atmosphere of revelation and regret. Inspector Blackwood closed her notebook with a decisive snap. Mr. Bradford, you'll need to come with us to make a formal statement. Your co-operation now might work in your favor later. She gestured to one of her officers, who stepped forward to escort the broken treasurer from the church. As Bradford was led away, David noticed something protruding from beneath the last pew, a small, leather-bound book that must have fallen from the treasurer's briefcase. He retrieved it carefully, recognizing Hannah's neat handwriting on the cover. It was her personal diary, the very one that had been reported missing after her death. "Inspector," he called out, holding up his discovery. Duke's ears perked up immediately, and he pressed closer to David, as if recognizing another piece of his beloved master's legacy. The final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but David knew that the full impact of this scandal was just beginning to ripple through the village. The betrayal of trust, the years of deception, and the tragic cost of one woman's dedication to the truth would change this community forever. As Inspector Blackwood took the diary, handling it with the reverence it deserved, David felt Duke lean against his leg, offering silent support. Together, they watched as the last rays of morning light illuminated the empty church, knowing that while Hannah Matthews' earthly story had ended, her quest for truth would continue through those she had left behind. A determined inspector, a curious journalist, and a faithful dog who had never stopped believing in justice. The investigation was far from over, but the foundations of truth had been laid, built on the courage of one woman and the unwavering loyalty of her four-legged companion. In the quiet of the empty church, as the echoes of Revelation still lingered in the air, David knew that Hannah's spirit would rest easier now that her final mission was being carried forward by those who shared her commitment to uncovering the truth, no matter the cost.